Okay, now I can get to another part. Avoid the need for standards. I'm not saying, like a lot of people think I'm saying, avoid standards. So that's not what I'm saying. I say avoid the need for standards. As soon as you see a project that says, yeah, okay, we can run this project, but first we have to decide on the standard for this terminology, you're doomed. That will never work. And that happens all the time. A little story again, because I was part of the European Commission for Healthcare IT Standards for a year. And the one thing I learned there is that anything you can do to avoid the need for standards is a win. Because if you have to go through that to get anywhere, you won't get anywhere. Eh? And part of the problem is that in Europe and in Sweden, standards are often developed first and then the applications. And that's partly due to that most people in the European Standards Commissions get paid for sitting there. A lot of money. In America, it's different. There, nobody gets paid for making standards. Standards are selected from the things that are on the market. So if you have 2 or 3 vendors doing different things, and they say, well, this doesn't work, so they sit down and then they agree on a standard. And the people that sit there are actually employees of these companies, so the standards organization doesn't pay them. In Europe, they get paid a lot of money. So they have an interest in just making standards for the heck of it. Eh? And they make standards by the metric ton. Eh? They call them deliverables. And the thing is, if you want to live in Brussels, you deliver deliverables. Eh? And most of them are fairly useless. I was also involved in actually adapting one of the standards for the episode of care, which is epicrisis, could you say, for Belgium. And then I sat down, and first I discovered they'd forgotten how the Belgian insurance system works, because there, the medical insurance is actually the head of family, which is insured, usually the man. Eh? He has the insurance. So the patient is not necessarily the person that is registered in health insurance, it's somebody else. And none of these standards had ever had accounted for the fact that maybe there are 2 persons involved in this. One, the insured, the second, the patient. So nothing worked, of course, because they forgot. Eh? Second thing is, I sat down and they had made a kind of object standard, not the same thing they're doing today, but this was using something that looked like Edifact. And they had made a standard to the relationship between the objects, and once you started to make something, it didn't work out. It simply wasn't possible to get these things together. So I was sitting there feeling like an idiot for half a year, saying, I must be a complete asshole, because these people sitting there, they see this is self-evident. I didn't understand it. So I went up to this guy at one of these meetings in Spain, this guy who was head of it, and I said, you have to explain this to me. I've been sitting here for months. I don't get this relation to work with that one, because if, I don't remember exactly. He looks at me and says, yeah, I noticed. He said, I noticed that a while back, but I can't say anything. It's a deliverable, right? He knew that it didn't work. This is totally amazing. I just said, threw it out, I invented my own standard. And all of a sudden, yeah, that's what you should have done. So the European standard being used in Belgium now, as far as I know, is a standard I just pulled out of my rear. Right? Has nothing to do with the European standard. It actually works. And they said, yeah, that's a good application. And they actually bragged about this, a good application of European standards. Has nothing to do with it. So if you can avoid the need for a standard, and you can, in practically all cases you can. Eh? If you need 2 lab systems to work together, you can say, yeah, but first we have to have a standard of the lab test. No, you don't. If you use encapsulation and you use XML and you use all these things, you can call it your own namespace. Somebody else has a namespace. If you really need to talk, you can have a link between the 2 and so forth and so on. So you can do it. Now, that's for lab codes. For terminologies, the same thing. If you look at the standard, there are useful standards that already exist, like ICD-10 is very useful. The ICD-10 is diagnosis and treatments, right? Standard codes by the World Health Organization. We use them all the time. Terminology, ACT, which is also a WHO standard, which is used for the grouping of pharmaceutical products in groups. Very useful. All these standards have in common that there are a few thousand terms, of which you use a few hundred. Terrible standards are things like SNOMED. 400,000 terms. You know, if you hear about we need 400,000 terms and then we'll build the system, it's like you're doomed. There is no way. There's an error in reasoning along here somewhere. Right? Nothing needs that many terms. Right? If you look at how they, I have no slides for this, but if you look at how they do, why they want to, everybody heard about SNOMED CT? Nobody hasn't heard. I don't have to explain what this is. The idea with SNOMED CT is then if you have common terms, predetermined terms, the computer can understand the records. Right? And you can interchange data from one system to another. My question then is, what do you want the computer to understand about the electronic healthcare record? Well, yes, they say, well, if it could read the record, it could make a diagnosis that the doctor missed. Right? So I say, no, it can't. Why? I give an example here in the text. If it says in the text of the record, patient is coughing, has a fever, I wouldn't be surprised if he got pneumonia just like his father had last week. Okay? And I write in another record, pulmonary infection is slowly improving. For me, it's overly clear. I mean, he has pulmonary infection, it's getting better. If you want to codify this in SNOMED, I only seen one decent example of SNOMED. It was from a veterinary examination of a horse with a suffle on his one of his valves, right? I don't have it anymore, but it was 28 slides. Just, I heard a noise at the heart of a horse. Right? 28 slides with descriptions of the whole expression in SNOMED CT. Right? You know, as compared to one sentence, is pretty bad. Right? If you wanted to translate this, it is horrible because this thing says pneumonia just like his father had last week. Just like these are expressions in SNOMED. Like his father, last week is an expression, but last week is his father, and it was just like his father's. But was it just like his father's last week, or was it just like the infection that his father had last week? Even that is ambiguous. Now, if we had this in SNOMED CT, what would the healthcare record do with it? I mean, it would perhaps draw the conclusion that the patient had pneumonia that was getting treated. So what? I already knew that. So if the computer said, hey, I understood this. He had pneumonia. I said, I know. You know, why are you telling me this? So they say, well, if we have this, we can make statistics of it. No, you can't, because I just showed you what anecdotal medicine is. You can't make statistics out of this. This is stupid. This is anecdotal medicine, if you would. You have no use for the terms. Another reason why you will never find useful data in a record is not only anecdotal, but it's a psychological reason, which you will immediately observe if you're ever next to a doctor doing a clinical examination of a patient. It's this. When the patient comes in, first of all, I read up a little bit in the electronic record or whatever. Then I talk to the patient and say, what's your problem? And if I'm lucky, he says he doesn't have a problem. Otherwise, he says, well, I have a headache, whatever. I examine the patient. I talk to him and say, we're going to do this examination, we're going to do that, prescriptions and so forth. I take little notes on a scrap of paper, and then he leaves. Then I dictate the record with my conclusions, or I write it down. Personally, I don't. I write while the patient is there, but I'm the only one, I think. Everybody else does this. What does that mean? That means that he writes down his examination and findings of the patient after he draws his conclusion about what is wrong with the patient, which means that nothing that you find in the record will ever contradict the conclusions, because it's humanly impossible. You already said, he has pneumonia, then I write down, I heard this on his lungs, even if he didn't. He has a fever, he probably has, whatever. And then I also saw a blue spot on his left knee. That has nothing to do with it. I'm not going to write that down. Okay? So, if you look in records, if you go back in records and look at them, you will never, 80, 90, 99% of the time, find any finding in the clinical examination that contradicts the conclusion, or even a finding that has nothing to do with the conclusion. If you had that blue spot on his left knee, it will not be mentioned, because that was not the problem. Which means that there is no data in the electronic healthcare record supporting any other diagnosis than that one that the doctor made, even if it's wrong. So there is nothing for an automated healthcare system to find, because it's not there.